No problem at all. So thanks very much, Isabel, for asking me to speak. I think it's very clear that the world's geopolitical state is a cause for concern, but it doesn't mean that sustainability is any less important, even though it is very much struggling to gain airtime amongst newer stories. I honestly think it probably makes the job for us working in this space even more important because we do not want to find ourselves celebrating geopolitical solutions just to find that the planet itself is beyond repair. So beyond voting, it's really hard to know what healthcare professionals can do to influence the minds of world leaders. So I choose to focus on what I can do, not on what I cannot influence. There's still a lot of people out there that think the best thing about the earth is if you poke holes in it, oil and gas come out. And the fossil fuel industry is still one, if not the most profitable industry in the world. And there's therefore lots of work to do. So I was asked to speak about plastic and waste, but if I only speak about plastic and waste, it's quite a narrow topic. And whilst it may stimulate a bit some change in a QI project, it won't change planetary trajectory. I always hope that if I present a bigger picture, I can stimulate a different way of thinking that can lead to some bigger change. And I'll talk about some of the changes that I've been working on during this talk. Some of it's not easy to present because I'm describing a changing world, not as a future threat to our children, but as a clear and present danger to many species, including us right now. So I'm actually going to jump in and talk about mass extinctions, not the cheeriest of topics, regardless how fascinating it can be. It's often quoted that the climate emergency is a healthcare emergency, but as you'll hear as I go through this talk, there are concerns that the planet is heading for a mass extinction event, possibly even a major one. If so, I think we really must think about how we phrase the narrative. And I certainly think about it as the climate emergency being a threat to the life of myself, my loved ones, my future security, and all the activities which I enjoy. So a mass extinction is defined as this: the loss of greater than 75% species within a relatively short time span, geologically speaking. It's got to be global, it's got to affect multiple taxa. And although this isn't an official definition here, it roughly equates to a temperature increase of 4 to 6 degrees at the rate of a degree centigrade every 100,000 years. Now, straight away, we get these kind of alarm bells ringing because, we're talking about 1.5 degrees at the moment since the start of the Industrial Revolution just a couple of hundred years ago. So you can see the speed of change straight away when we are thinking about mass extinction events. So if we go back through geological time, all the way back to here, to the Ordovician period, there was a mass extinction event here hundreds of millions of years ago. This was related to plate tectonics and volcanoes, as was the end Devonian extinction, again, about 400 million years ago. So we can kind of explain those really easily. Okay, big mass extinction events as the world was forming, not a lot of life, very, very little life as we know it today. Before we go on to the next mass extinction out of the 5, we've got to acknowledge a period called the Carboniferous period. This was 300 million years ago, roughly, and it was the time when we had millipedes about 2.5 meters long and flying insects the size of extremely large birds. Now, the thing about the Carboniferous was it was the age of oxygen. Everything grew really, really, really well. And we got massive amounts of plant coverage during this period of time. Now, this didn't end abruptly, it just ended gradually as the oxygen fell at the end of the Carboniferous period about 300 million years ago. And all this vegetation, all this organic matter, it died, it rotted into the ground, and eventually over many years it formed coal. That's where the carbon in Carboniferous comes from. It comes from the word carbon bearing. So what happened later, we had another 2 mass extinction events here. The end Triassic, which again was very similar. That was a lot of volcanoes, a lot of plate tectonics. And then the end Permian, 252 million years ago. This was the biggest mass extinction event that ever took place. It again started with volcanoes in Russia. And then what happened here was quite unusual. It stimulated, because of the geographic location, basically the burning of coal, the burning of the organic matter that was created 300 million years ago at the end of the Carboniferous period. So bizarrely, this was almost like an industrial revolution. It was burning coal on a vast scale. As a result, we got incredible amounts of CO2 released, acid rain. This caused a mass die-off in the oceans. And this geological period saw the loss of over 95% of life on Earth. So an extremely major extinction event. It is commonly known as the Great Dying. We then have the fifth mass extinction event, the end Cretaceous, or the KT, and this is the only extinction event that was caused by an asteroid, the 15-kilometer wide Chicxulub asteroid that struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, causing the end of the age of dinosaurs. And I think the age of dinosaurs is kind of in the Mesozoic period here, is worth reflecting on. They lived really for about 135 million years. That is a third of the time that we have really had significant life on Earth. So if you're an alien kind of coming along and visiting Earth every few hundred million years or so, or every 10 million years or so, you probably come to the conclusion, actually, this was the planet of the dinosaurs, not the planet of humans, because they lasted 135 million years, very small brains, but they lived in balance with nature. They had an imbalanced ecosystem between those animals that ate plants, animals that ate plants, those that preyed on those animals. And as a result, they lasted for 135 million years, and they were thriving when the asteroid hit. Apologies. There is now worth just drawing your attention to another minor extinction event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We can just see it here, this very abrupt spike here in temperature. This again was caused by volcanic eruptions. It is the fastest the temperature has ever gone up on the planet, and it was associated with CO2 release of about 0.6 gigatons per year. Now, if you think what we are actually putting out into the atmosphere now, we are putting out 40 gigatons of CO2 a year, as opposed to the 0.6 that caused this minor extinction event. So again, huge cause for concern here, as this minor extinction event that lost almost about 70% of life on Earth was putting out far less CO2 into the atmosphere than we are putting out now. The reason why this didn't turn into a major extinction event was simply because at the end Permian, we had about a trillion coccolithophores that were all dying in the ocean, leaving their carbonate skeletons that now we can see here in the White Cliffs of Dover, but at the time it was on the sea floor. And this carbonate matter buffered the acidity within the ocean. And as a result, we didn't get quite the spike in ocean acidity of the end Permian. So actually, this big outpouring of CO2 and temperature spike did not cause the same level of extinction. If we now fast forward to man, we've only as Homo sapiens existed for about 280,000 years. We have not seen CO2 at the level that we have today since 3 million years ago, and we've not seen ocean acidification that we are seeing today since about 15 million years ago. So this is entirely new for us. We've never been exposed to this before. We were born into the Pleistocene period, where you see the CO2 going up and down here. We are in the Ice Age. You can see it here. We're in a kind of ice house period at the moment on Earth. So we've been born into an ice age, essentially. But what has happened, as you can see, we've gone along quite happily here, and suddenly we've got this huge spike in CO2, which is the result of our industrial activity. The last 10,000 years where civilization has thrived, we have actually had unprecedented climate stability. And again, you can only have climate stability with a balance of greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere and taken in by natural means. And so we had balance, 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 and then suddenly, boom, we've hit an industrial revolution and our CO2 has gone through the roof. You can just see here just the extreme situation that we find ourselves in. So CO2, however, it's just not the enemy. It's an impurity in air. It's a tiny, tiny 0.04% of air. And as we know, energy from the sun falls on plants. They take in CO2, they give out oxygen, and in time, these plants die and become sequestered. In fact, pretty much all the building blocks of life created through photosynthesis, the glucose for energy, and all the building blocks that make the growth of plants possible, it all comes from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And even if we look at our own bodies, we are about 98% carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But it doesn't just happen on land, it happens in the ocean as well. Again, sunlight falls on photosynthesizing phytoplankton, such as these coccolithophores. They take in CO2, they've got water all around them, they produce oxygen that is used by all species in the ocean itself to thrive, because most of the animals in the ocean still require oxygen, just like we do. And then the carbon in the ocean, eventually through the death of all these tiny organisms, gets sequestered in the sediments. This process of sucking in CO2, giving out oxygen, it happens on a geological timescale, 300 million years, the coal that we're digging up to 200 million years, the oil that we are digging up. It takes millions of years to put it there, but we have taken all this and we've lit a match and we've exploded all this carbon into the atmosphere where it reacts with the oxygen, forming this enormous amount of CO2. So what we have essentially done is we have tipped the balance away from sequestration and towards emission of these greenhouse gases. Now, hopefully this is all taken up by plants, but we know this isn't the case because we just simply aren't enough plants on the planet. And it would be lovely if it's all taken up by the ocean, but unfortunately there just isn't enough in the way of phytoplankton to take this up. So the CO2 reacts with water and forms carbonic acid, acidifying the ocean. And unfortunately, there just aren't enough plants, so the CO2 hangs around in the air. We then have the greenhouse effect and global warming. So how the heck did we get here? I mean, this is a really bad situation to be in. And it goes back to this lady here, Eunice Foote, who was a US scientist and women's rights campaigner. And in 1856, she discovered the greenhouse effect. So a long, long time ago. We then have these kind of positive markers here. This is the Keeling curve showing the growth of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can see it oscillating as the Earth breathes in and out once every year. So here we have the start of the Keeling curves being plotted. Here we had James Hansen presenting to the Senate on the greenhouse effect. Really was, this is back at like 350 parts per million. This was a potential pivotal moment for change. We have COP1. We have COP21, the Paris Agreement. We've had all this going on, and yet CO2 keeps climbing. And it keeps climbing because when we go back to Lyndon Johnson, then we go through Ronald Reagan, President Bush, unfortunately, the oil companies like Exxon were producing reports that were falling on the desks of politicians, especially in the US, and they were ignored and buried because it didn't serve the interest of those in office to put a lid, especially on oil production, which was the second industrial revolution. So unfortunately, how did we get here? The science was there, the reports were being made, it was being ignored at a political level because it might hurt the economy. And all of us have a very, very good reason to get really angry right now because we have been essentially deceived by many people over many, many decades, and we are now being asked to make changes to bear the brunt of these impacts. And if we're not angry at the moment, we should be, but certainly those in the global south who are taking the bulk of these impacts should be extremely angry. The trajectory is not good. We have a high and growing CO2. We have increasing amounts of fossil fuels being burnt every year. Temperatures are rising. Even last year, greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.1%. We are on track for a 2.7-degree world. We have well and truly written off 1.5 as a target. We are now heading for 2 degrees C as a target. The big concern, as I've mentioned, is the rate of change of CO2, of temperature, of extinction levels of animals. Animals cannot move fast enough to outrun the changing world. We are seeing some movement in some macro species such as whales and sharks, but the rate of change is just unprecedented. As I've said, we are seeing 20 times the rate of change of CO2 as we saw in the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And even when we compare to the end Permian extinction event, we are seeing CO2 emitted into the atmosphere 100 times faster than the Great Dying. Now, it may be different this time around, because when we had the end Permian, we had this big single continent, Pangaea, and the Panthalassic Ocean, and we did not have a buffering capacity. So we can keep our fingers crossed that things will be different, but there are no guarantees. And as a result, who really wants to kind of take that chance? Are we heading for a mass extinction event? Well, the background extinction rate is usually between 1 to 5 species per year under normal conditions. We're presently seeing a extinction rate between 100 and 10,000 times higher than the background extinction rate. One thing is for certain with respects to biodiversity, we are conducting a huge experiment at the moment, and one where at the moment it really isn't looking positive. We need to reduce CO2 just enormously and all greenhouse gas emissions. These are the national determined contributions. We need to be on this green line for 1.5, which is all but written off. And you can see here that the targets, the pledges, everything falls short, way short, and we have to do a lot better. Can we sequester our way out of this? Well, all the tech that is being touted as a solution, it doesn't even scratch the surface at the moment. And the energy required to actually suck in the CO2 is phenomenal. We are still losing something like 10 to 20 football pitches worth of trees every minute. Coastal blue carbon is wonderful. Seagrass doesn't burn, but unfortunately there will be a ceiling to the amount of carbon that can sequester, perhaps 1 billion tons if we're lucky. And land use change is going in the wrong direction because we're turning more land over to agriculture. We then have the ocean itself. We have 1 billion tons of photosynthesizing phytoplankton turning over every single 8 days. It photosynthesizes the whole time it is doing so, sucking in CO2 and sequestering it into the deep ocean over many, many years. But again, it seems as though the pollution, the rising temperatures are redistributing the phytoplankton. And again, as much as I would love to say that the ocean is an incredible solution to the climate challenge, I don't think it is. I think all of these things, all these sequestration mechanisms are important, but they're important because if we kind of kill off these mechanisms with pollution and loss of biodiversity, then simply it makes our job harder. So we know we're locked in. If we get to net zero tomorrow, we are locked into temperatures that we have today for many, many decades to come. That is an absolute fact. We cannot say if we get to net zero, the temperatures don't start falling. The CO2 is there for obviously many hundreds of years. We know there is massive vulnerability to humans, not so much to the planet. The planet will survive, species will bounce back. But we know from Lancet Countdown and the WHO that we have a whole host of health impacts which are only going to grow. They are going to place impacts on healthcare facilities and healthcare systems. And as a result, we are going to see healthcare systems overwhelmed. Just think what COVID was like, one virus. We have a lot more to come. We are going to have problems, obviously, feeding billions of people. They are going to migrate. We are going to have a lot of conflict. This all implies that, or this is all on the grounds that everything changes slowly. We also have tipping points, which are abrupt system changes. There are 15 identified, and there is already concern that the Atlantic meridional overtone in circulation, which is the big kind of overtoning of water between the hemispheres, is slowing down. We're seeing massive die-off of coral reef, even in Ningaloo Reef in northwest Australia. And, we are seeing weakening of the Western Antarctic ice sheet in the Thwaites Glacier. So if we get a tipping point, suddenly everything can actually speed up. If you've not checked out the planetary boundaries model, I would thoroughly recommend you do so. It is a fabulous piece of work. CO2 only is 1/2 of one planetary boundary, and this shows all the interconnectedness of all the systems that we rely upon in order to keep the planet within a climate niche. We have broken 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, according to the Potsdam Institute. Again, these are massive red flags, cause for concern. So would thoroughly recommend you check that out. It's a fabulous institute and amazing work. So my sustainability journey came from when I was a child. This was my favorite childhood mammal, the Yangtze river dolphin, and I also absolutely love the northern white rhino. We all have favorite animals when we're kids. These were 2 of mine. So in about 2017, 2018, I started to become aware of sustainability, healthcare pressures on healthcare systems. I happened to randomly Googled the Yangtze river dolphin and found out that it had been made extinct or registered extinct in 2006, and I was gutted. And so I set up my Trust Sustainability group. I worked across the Northeast in a couple of other groups, worked with the CSH, the Intensive Care Society, and I set up CPD Match as a vehicle to help educate healthcare professionals in climate and environment to try and give them the confidence to use their voice to help drive change. And I started working on lots of CDDFT as my trust, lots of work streams within the hospital to try and drive change. And one of these was related to plastic, which is what I was invited here to talk about. So you probably think, thank God he's not talking about mass extinction anymore. I can completely understand that. Plastic are simple monomers. Here we have ethane, propane, and vinyl chloride. And these simple monomers are turned into polymers utilizing any number of 16,000 chemicals, only 6% of which are regulated globally. 99% of plastics are derived from fossil fuels. The industry produces about 2 billion tons of CO2 per year, so roughly about the same as all healthcare globally. So plastics are carbon, they're part of net zero. Plastic production's increased about 230 times since 1950. It still increasing. It is predicted to double by 2040, triple by 2026, and 7 of the 9.2 billion tons produced up to 2017 is now classified as waste, either in landfill, in the environment. Only about 9% has ever been recycled. About 10 million tons. I'm going to skip straight to this slide. This is a far more obvious slide when it comes to seeing how plastic gets into the ocean. But about 10 million tons of plastic gets into the ocean every year. Even though we think about plastic in the ocean as being macroplastic, about 90% is micro or nanoplastic from car tires, from paints, or the breakdown of larger plastics. Ingestion leads to physical and chemical harm. It's known to cause harm to about 1,300 species in the land, on the land and ocean, and it interferes with things like the biological pump in the ocean, which helps sequester carbon. Plastic endangers both planetary and human health. It causes diseases across the whole host of organ systems. All the way from plastic workers, fossil fuel workers, plastic workers, fence line communities around the facilities that turn plastics into products, plastic users, patients, and obviously, and also from the disposal and recycling industry. A lot of these harms are caused through endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are expressed in very small concentrations, but with a large impact on the organisms itself, including humans. And it's estimated that in the US, the costs associated with disease, disability, premature deaths caused by three chemicals in plastic cost the US almost $1 trillion per year in 2015 money. So these are not insignificant costs and impacts, and these are externalized by the fossil fuel and plastic industry onto healthcare. So what have we done to reduce healthcare plastic? I mean, it should actually be quite easy because the UN is right behind this. It really wants to kind of reduce the impact of plastic on the environment and on people. And the Plastics Treaty has been running for a few years. It wants to ban the most harmful chemicals. It wants universal design guidance for things commonly used like bottles. It wants financing and support for poorer countries, and it wants a reduction in plastic production. And this is the sticking point because the fossil fuel states and industries simply resist this reduction in plastic production because it is incredibly popular. And healthcare is really dependent upon plastic. And because we know that harms occur from plastic and most of them come from fossil fuels, it makes sense to use as little as possible. And from my perspective, this is certainly how I started thinking about my relationship with plastic. I really just thought I need to use as little of it as possible in my practice. But I think there are a wide range of things that we can honestly do to reduce reduce our use of single-use plastic in healthcare. It doesn't have to just be the responsibility of those healthcare professionals, such as in secondary care. So the most powerful thing I think we can do is to improve health. Support initiatives to keep yourself and others healthy and active, because the least polluting healthcare is that which does not need to occur. The less healthcare we need to provide, the less plastic we use. If we have patients scheduled for surgery, we should really invest into schemes that actually keep or improve the health of patients before they have surgery. This is how much plastic we use for one intensive care patient, consumables, one intensive care patient in one day. An awful lot of this is plastic. So we have to be making very sensible decisions about who we provide care to, because once we start giving care, we start consuming products and we start producing waste and pollution. So we absolutely, there is no place anymore for, well, let's just give it a go. There's no evidence that this will work. We'll just give it a go because we've got a spare intensive care bed. That's not good enough. That causes harm to planet and therefore people. With respects to our decision making, we must be really critical about the care that we are providing every day and aim to move patients on and demedicalize them as soon as possible. We have to educate staff about materials. Here we have a mask made out of a thermoplastic elastomer instead of PVC, which is a particularly nasty sort of plastic. Here we have a giving set from B. Braun made out of polyurethane, not PVC, which is a infinitely better plastic because it reacts less with drugs, etc., which are given through those giving sets. So material education is key. We need to rethink what we use, not use things that aren't needed. These are largely, it's an anesthetic device. It is largely unnecessary in most anesthetics. And so we just should not open it, not use it. We should challenge our traditional practice. We should try, when patients are on vast numbers of intravenous medications, to try and get them onto oral if possible. You can see the difference in waste, and many of the drugs we use have incredibly good oral bioavailability. Extending use as well, we are starting to experiment with not throwing these giving sets away so readily. We have an injection port here. So what we are now looking at is when an infusion is finished, if the patient isn't on intravenous fluids, is actually using aseptic technique, folding the distal end back, attaching it to the injection port, and then when the next drug is needed, we simply unfold it, reattach it to the cannula, again, aseptic technique, and reuse the giving set. So this is something we are looking at as well. We must be cautious, however, when we think about circularity is a good thing, but it can't replace all single-use devices. There are individuals who really have an issue with single-use endoscopes, but this is an Ambu A scope, and we use these on critical care. I remember the days when we didn't have them, and patient progress was slower when we didn't have them, and that lack of progress has its own environmental impact. So without these on critical care, patient progress slows down, and therefore environmental impact goes up. So it's just something to bear in mind. Sometimes you just need to have single-use devices. We must engage, communicate, and work with suppliers. I've not just put Bieber on up here because they're German. I've put it up there because I work with them very closely, because they are one of the most environmentally ambitious organizations. I think we have to get over ourselves with respect to conflicts of interest. We have to be open and transparent, because working together, we are far more powerful, and they are supporting the initiative that I just described here. We must work with procurement, because sometimes cost just really muddies the water. This medicinal waste bin is cheaper than this medicinal waste bin. This one contains 2 grams of plastic. This one contains 60 grams of plastic. We argued that this one was better because of the lower plastic content, but we had to make our case to procurement that as clinicians, they couldn't force us to cause avoidable planetary harm through the use of plastic. So we actually managed to get them to swap our trust, to swap back to the low plastic, slightly more expensive alternative, using this argument and explaining to them very carefully why we wanted these products. Optimizing waste management is extremely important, because pretty much all single-use items, once opened, become waste, whether they're used or not. We produce about 500,000 tonnes of waste, I think it is, in the NHS overall per year, 150,000 tonnes of which is clinical. We provide guidance, really detailed guidance of what can go in which waste stream. And we have, 9 waste streams on this poster. And we really do tell people what they can put in what waste stream. And it's really, really important to do this, because in the UK, and I can't obviously speak for Germany, but in the UK, our waste is classified as non-hazardous until suspected or proven otherwise. And that is massively important due to the environmental and financial cost of processing. So in COVID, we had a lot of these orange bins, which are hazardous waste, and some clinical areas just kept them because it's dead easy. You just shoved everything in there. But as you'll see in a second, that's an extremely uneconomical and environmentally unsound way of disposing of waste. Pharmaceuticals, another message, this is just a kind of background principle. Pharmaceuticals must never be disposed of down the sink, because we have 2,000 active pharmaceutical ingredients in the UK. We do not know what they do individually or in combination to all those thousands of species that live in our fresh waters, and we cannot take the chance. It is also illegal to dispose of pharmaceuticals down sinks. What we need to do is to introduce what we call offensive waste streams. So this is a hazardous waste stream. This is a sharps bin. This is actually domestic waste streams here, recyclables, non-recyclables. And these are that's an offensive waste stream. That is a tiger bag, so non-infectious, non-hazardous waste, and a medicinal waste stream, which again is non-infectious, non-hazardous. Now, introducing these to in our anesthetic rooms, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bins, helps us redirect waste away from hazardous to offensive with a far lower environmental cost. If we can get our waste into the tiger bin and the blue bin, they travel 16 miles. There is no pre-processing. It's £360 per tonne to dispose of, and we get energy from waste and aggregate to build things, roads and stuff with. If this waste went into the orange and the sharp bin being the yellow bin here, it travels 200 miles. It is autoclave first, which takes energy. It is expensive, and we don't get any energy from waste. So educating people and getting the waste into the right waste streams has a massive impact from the point of view of environment and cost. We use these waste pathways to educate about waste, to educate about plastic, to educate about sustainability. So our outcomes from this We took away our plastic sharp spins. We put up stickers in our truss to say, do not put medicinals down the sink, because we are giving you a medicinal waste stream, reusable sharp spins. And here you can see inside one of these, all the medicinal waste that is accumulating. And as a result, on our ICU, these are patchy figures, I should say, because these were done retrospectively, but we direct every year 6.4 tons away from hazardous to offensive. We save 800 kilograms in virgin plastic in sharp spins. We reduce costs. We reduce CO2 from processing. We just don't know how much in ITU, and it's a great educational opportunity. In our 12 operating theatres, we haven't calculated that figure, but we reduce the use of virgin plastic, miles travelled, we generate energy from waste, we reduce costs, and we reduce CO2. So it is a big, big win. So my sustainability journey, I was doing all these internal jobs. I found out that, as I said, the Yangtze River dolphin became extinct. The last northern white rhino, Sudan, died. The last male northern white rhino died, leaving 2 females. And the blue whale, after quite a nice recovery from 2,000 to 20,000 whales, after the whaling ban came in, it plateaued because of ship strike. And from the fishing for krill in the south in the Antarctic Ocean, Southern Ocean. So because of all these things that I was reading, and because nobody was talking about oceans in sustainability, I co-founded Healthcare Ocean to give oceans a voice. I joined NHS England's Sustainable Procurement Forum so I could reach our suppliers. I spent some time presenting at COP26 and working with the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. Joined the UK Ocean Decade Committee, was invited to join that. I stayed with that for about 3 years. And then I started working with other groups like Proteus, like Veer, which is a sustainable shipping company, and doing some academic work with university students to really try and give oceans that voice that was needed in human healthcare strategy, and to do engagement beyond healthcare, because I was doing a lot of speaking as part of Healthcare Ocean, but the people I was speaking to weren't always the ones who could drive change. Dolphin Runner, I'll come back to later if I have time. So I am really cognizant that I'm already at 36 minutes, and I can't believe that has gone so fast. So I will speed up if it's okay, Isabel, because obviously it'd be nice to leave some time for questions. So I'll go through the ocean bits fairly quickly so we can come back to waste. But the ocean is 322 million cubic miles of water. About 0.03% of water is available to humans. It is the largest interconnected ecosystem on Earth. It absorbs most of the heat responsible for global warming. It's got most of the living space. It stores huge amounts of carbon. It produces oxygen. It absorbs CO2. When the CO2 load gets too much, I hinted about this earlier, then the ocean acidifies, and we are seeing the ocean acidify on a scale over decades that we shouldn't see happening, that we should only see happening over geological timescales. And it's not too big to fail. And at the moment, it is becoming warmer, more acidic, and more hypoxic. We have got a loss of 10% of ocean oxygen guaranteed in the future just from the warming that's taken place already. And that is a significant threat. It is responsible for primary production, that due to this migration of animals that occurs at night to feed on all these planktonic species, sucks the water and the CO2 down in particulate form into the deeper oceans a few hundred meters down, which then allows sequestration of the carbon in deep oceans. I've mentioned the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, and recently, end of last year, Iceland actually deemed it a security risk, because if it does slow down, then Iceland is going to become even colder, and certainly the UK and Northwest Europe, including Germany, will become a lot colder as we head into potentially what could be very similar to an ice age. Oceans feed billions, primary protein for about 3 billion people, and we've seen the loss of certain species around the planet, and we've seen This orange dots here is the threat to food production, fisheries catch in low latitudes, which again will lead to climate migration. Ocean, we are dependent on the ocean for mental health and well-being and physical health, and certainly there is an increased coastline that is now suitable for Vibrio to survive and be transmitted. We are dependent on the ocean for new medicines, for subsea internet cables. Over 95% of internet traffic travels under the ocean. For renewable energy, we're only just scratching the surface with respects to renewable energy and the ocean. It's extremely difficult to do, but once it's in place, it can provide incredible amounts of energy. And of course, 90% of our goods are supplied on container ships. Now, container shipping is one of the areas that I absolutely love. It is a big ticket item. It is a big engagement piece, a big communication piece. I could go into it now. I'm not going to because of time. So I'll flick through these slides. We've only really had container shipping since 1956. It is a force for good. Nothing else on the planet can move goods around as sustainably as container shipping. The longest ships are longer than the Empire State Building is tall. They use horrible bunker fuels to fuel most container ships, which is full of impurities and carbon. It is regulated globally, but unfortunately, it is not changing quickly enough. We are working within NHS England and through using our Voice of Healthcare Ocean to drive container shipping through the buying power of suppliers to use cleaner fuels. And we are trying to inspire action by recommending organizations like VEER, a zero-emission shipping company, because if we can get all our goods delivered by container ship, that's not going to change planetary trajectory, but it might just change the shipping industry and help reduce its 2 billion tons of CO2 that it produces every year. One of the things that I find absolutely fascinating is the interconnectedness of harms and climate and carbon sequestration. About 20,000 whales die every year from ship strike. If we could increase the number of whales actually in the ocean back to pre-whaling days of 4 to 5 million great whales, the fertilization of the photic zone that they cause through eating and then defecating in the photic zone could stimulate an amount of phytoplankton that would sequester about 1.7 billion tons of CO2 annually, which is about 62 NHSs, including all of its supply chains. So just by changing the behavior of ships, we could actually, sequester huge amounts of CO2 in the oceans itself. That is the sort of work that I am keen to do as a healthcare professional by using what I've told you about this risk, the risk to health, the risk to us all through mass extinction events, explain this to the container shipping industry to try and drive change within a big industry using my trusted voice as a healthcare professional. So my reflections, we are on a trajectory to potentially a mass extinction, massive risk to absolutely everybody. We are not to blame. However, this has all been known for absolute decades. People have not acted who had economic interests. The healthcare system, I don't believe we should beat ourselves up about our footprint too much. We must recognize ourselves as being the good guys here. We are trying to keep people healthy so that they can mitigate and adapt to the climate and environmental emergency. We produce about 5% of global CO2 output. That means there's 95% from other industries. Let us use our voice to drive that change in bigger industries. Let's lean on the fact that, we must have hope here. Just that previous slide where I said about the whales, 1.7 billion tons, that is something that is achievable. That is something that can change trajectory and slow down the rate of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. And I just draw upon, what gives me hope, these big ticket items, what drives me forward? Well, my children, in their 20s, I want them to have a future. So this love of my children and this want of them and all other people on the planet to have a future is what drives me forward. And we must recognize our superpower as healthcare professionals. We have a trusted voice that we should use. Climate and environmental literacy is where CPD Match comes in. There is an appetite. It's existed, this website has existed for a few years. It's only really the last year we've pivoted formally towards climate and environment. The site is in evolution. It is really just a database at the moment, but it is going to change. We have a very holistic value proposition. We don't just focus on healthcare professionals, we focus on the whole value chain. So that includes our suppliers, because our suppliers have the buying power in which to decide, which ships to use. So if we can educate our suppliers like B. Braun, like Philips, like Ambu, like Intersurgical, to name a few, we educate their staff, we educate their procurement teams, we can hopefully drive that change. We are sponsored at the moment by environmentally ambitious organizations. We include the whole value chain, but we are moving to a new model as of this year where we are going to form structured educational pathways called the Climate Path. We should have our first in place by April or May. So in summary, trajectory is concerned, stakes are high. We are not to blame. We are essential. Let's stand proud, recognize that. Learn all you can as healthcare professionals. I think that is a key message. Focus on what you can do and act, even if it is small scale, because you can then use this as a communication and education point. Think beyond healthcare and carbon. Think what your voice can do on the big stage, and use your voice to inspire change. And just to finish off with the dolphin runner, about a year ago, I decided that I was preaching to the converted a lot of the time. I was doing park runs. I don't know if they have them in Germany, 5-kilometer timed runs every Saturday morning. So I decided to throw on a dolphin outfit and go out and run park runs around the northeast of England. And when people come up and say, why are you dressed as a dolphin? I can explain that the oxygen in every other breath they take comes from the ocean, and we must never forget the ocean in anything we do. And that's it. And I go out and I hopefully put a smile on people's faces, have a good time, and do a little bit of education at the same time.